I've seen many things, but never something quite like this. Generally, I do actually see more than most people do. Now, I know that you think that I am somewhat heavenly minded. Perhaps you think I'm too heavenly minded, because I do make a habit of studying the stars. There are other things that I study as well, things that intrigue me, hidden and unseen things. It's actually in my blood because I'm part of a caste, and it's a priestly caste. I'm descended from a long line of priests who have cultivated that gift to peer into hidden and secret things. That was a craft that was passed down to me by my fathers, together with a lot of different ancient stories, myths and legends, and there have even been a few stories that I suspected had just a grain of truth. There was one story in particular that I long suspected to be true. It was one that I had heard from my fathers, and we had just little fragmentary scribblings. That was really all that I knew about it. But the story goes something like this: that many moons ago there was a prophet. Now he was an exile in our country. He had come from very far away. It was a tiny little dot on the map, at least in comparison with the old empire. But even though this exile did not belong to a priesthood like we did, and he worshipped a foreign god, it was a tribal deity of the land of his people, he also had the gift, and he saw visions. I believe Daniel was his name in the Hebrew language. Now, deep in our libraries, we did have a copy of the book of his prophecies. To understand it, you'd have to brush up on your Hebrew and your Aramaic. But I had read it, and if you read it, I think you would find it marvelous. You would understand my fascination. There was a particular passage from Daniel that had long intrigued me. Daniel writes, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." Now, you might say to yourself, like some of the other magi did, that is there a people that doesn't have stories like this of a God coming down among the mortals and promising them eternal life and everlasting kingdom? All the common rabble have stories like this so that their worldly kings can keep on ruling and they be left well enough alone. But for a long time I have been drawn to Daniel and to the figure that he describes, the one who is given dominion and rule by the hidden God. I have spent a fair bit of my time in kings' courts. Kings like to call on me for my wisdom. One thing I know about kings is that kings are to be obeyed and they are never to be corrected. There are exceptions, though. And the one who was king in Daniel's day, Nebuchadnezzar, was one who very rarely had the ability to admit when he'd been chastened. I really wouldn't have thought much about Daniel's prophecies if it had not been for another story. It's one that I think you all know because these holy books are easier for you to come by than for me. It's the story of Daniel's friends, the ones who had raised the ire of Nebuchadnezzar because they would not worship him. They preferred their native God, and so he threw them into the fiery furnace. They survived, you might recall, because they were protected by the fourth man, the one that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in the midst of the flame. And Nebuchadnezzar himself had said that this man had the appearance like a son of the gods. Now, as I said, I have seen many things in this world and beyond, but I'll tell you one thing that I have never seen, because I have never seen my own people's gods. But Nebuchadnezzar was convinced. And the very fact that the three men, Daniel's friends, came out of the flames and they survived, I think that is proof that there was someone else there. And I think that this is the one whom Daniel foretold, the one who is going to have an everlasting kingdom over all peoples and nations. I'm rambling a little bit. You're here because of the star, and we saw it right away from our observatories. And it was one of the stranger things that I've seen. I've made it a career to study stars, and this one behaved in a way that no other star behaves. It's hard to explain unless you've seen it, but generally speaking, stars really can't point you to a particular place. Now, you can follow the general direction of stars, but this one, there was something different about, that it had a certain allure, and it called to me, and called to two other of the Magi. It beckoned to me, and so we thought that perhaps we should follow it. The rest of the Magi thought we were crazy. They imagined that we spent too much time among the parchments and up in the watchtowers. But this star, because it called to us, we felt that we had to obey. We made the journey to Judea, and that was my idea because, quite frankly, I am the wisest. But we went to Judea because I suspected, because Daniel was a Judean, that perhaps it was the Judean God who had put the star in the sky. And if he had done that, if he had put this sign for everybody to see, then that might mean that the king that he had promised, the one who would rule universally over everybody, it might mean that he was coming. And so we made our journey. It might have been a lapse in wisdom on our part that we stopped in Jerusalem, but at the time it made sense because the exiles, their king in Judah, had ruled there in Jerusalem. So naturally we thought that the most natural thing you would do is you would go to Jerusalem, to the capital, and there you would find the king. And so we started to make inquiries about the newborn king of the Jews, and we were met generally with nervous looks. And eventually we were ushered into what was supposed to be the palace of the King of the Jews. Now, as I said, I have hung out in royal courts before, and I know a king when I see one. And Herod wasn't it. He wasn't a king, I mean. What we saw in Herod was a puppet ruler from the Romans. He was a dark and a calculating and a paranoid man. His eyelid twitched just a little bit when I asked him, I thought, innocently enough, if he could point us where we would find the one who, unlike him, was born King of the Jews. I admit, I asked him just to annoy him. But after a few whispered words to a servant, the king summoned his own wise men. And he brought in the scribes and the high priests and the teachers, and it surprised me how much unlike Daniel they were. Because when we shared with them the news that the star heralded the coming of their king, they did not really rejoice. Now, they knew the answer. They knew their holy writings very well, and they told Herod that the king was to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, but I could feel their unease. And Herod was ill at ease too. He tried to hide it, but you see, I have a penchant for seeing things that people try to hide. And I noted the glint in his eye when he said that we should go by ourselves to Bethlehem post-haste, find the king, and then return to him. Report back that I too may come and worship him. We could not leave there fast enough. And then when we did go, and we went on our way to Bethlehem, I do have to admit that before we had been lost. Because the star really only proved to be so helpful. It was really only when we heard from the scriptures, when they told us where the Christ was to be born, that when we went back out into the night, then the star was more helpful. And it practically drew us all the way to Bethlehem. As I said, I have seen many things. and I've never quite seen something like what greeted us in the house. We saw the child. We saw him in the lap of his mother. What was it like? Well, here words actually fail me, because all we could do was to fall down and worship the one that had been given dominion and glory and power over all. We did rejoice exceedingly with great joy. Just to be clear, we did rejoice. But I do have to tell you that that sense of unease that we felt in Herod's palace has never quite left me. The same unease that we saw etched on their faces is still with me after all of this time. You have a poet, T.S. Eliot was his name, and he actually told my story. I'd like to give you Mr. Eliot's words. At the end of his poem, he says, "All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were very different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We return to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death." And seeing that child was like a death. We did rejoice at the time to see him newborn and at the beginning of his life. But here is the burden of being wise. There's a certain burden to seeing things that other people cannot see. You realize after you have an encounter like that the old world is now gone, that most everyone you know still clings to their delusions and to their idols. That child was the death of everything that I had known, of all of the knowledge that I was so proud to have amassed, all the secret treasures that I had collected for myself. And I no longer feel at home, even in my own homeland, up in my observatory. And I feel that way because I know that I will never see anything else as compelling and as alluring as the star and the child that it led us to. I had thought that birth and death were very different, but you know that they go together hand in hand in this child. I had one vision more, and I have seen very little since then. But when I saw the child, because I do know some things about palms, I looked in the palms of his hands, and it was as if I had seen the mark of nails. I looked into his eyes, and I saw the shadow of a Roman cross. It was his gaze that captivated me the most, that it was a gaze of pure love. It's really not for me to say anything else, because he appointed his own apostles and wise men and prophets to reveal all of these things to you. But you know of what I speak. You know how birth and death will be married together in this child. It's strange to say. It's strange even for me to say, because I do delight in strange things and in hidden mysteries. But to use Eliot's phrase, I should be glad of another death. With another death, with his death, then all the kingdoms of the world, like the one that I once called home, will fall and give way to the kingdom that truly will be everlasting. And that death would, in a profound and mysterious way, give new birth. And if that is what it takes, even if it means the demise of everything, of the dethroning of mad kings and the toppling of orders of magi, then yes, I should be glad of another death. That is one final mystery that I very much hope to see.